Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Gabriel Crouse. Gabriel, how are you doing?
Salve, Agricolae. Good to be with you.
Salve indeed. And we are also joined today by Mr. Sholan Booysen. Sholan, how are you?
As always, Nick, excited to be on the show with yourself and Gabriel. So, yeah, definitely looking forward to our discussion.
So thank you, Sholan, for being here, because I know that you have exams next week, and that's going to be some hectic stuff. But anyway, good luck for that. So let's just start off by quickly checking in. Of course, we talked earlier this week about the Dis-Chem memorandum that went around placing a moratorium on the hiring of white people, and how there was an awful lot of kind of corporate weaseling that went on to try and simultaneously claim that the memorandum had been retracted, but at the same time, the policy remained. It's not entirely clear. Gabriel, the IRA is running a campaign about race laws and about this. Can you just update us on what you know?
Yeah, so on this, we wrote to the Dis-Chem board to ask for clarity on their statement. They said that the original, it's been called a memorandum, the original letter from the CEO to senior managers, if you want to call that a memorandum, they say they regret the tone and the wording of that. Who cares about the tone and the wording? This is very serious stuff. They also say it doesn't reflect their values. We're not sure what that means. Maybe they're saying, well, this is racist and our values are not racist. Or maybe they're saying the problem is that CEO Ivan Saltzman said, we don't want to hire any new people of a particular race because the government's effectively got a gun to our head, because we face a potential 10% of turnover fine, which would be 3 billion rand. And that's just going to cripple the business. Get that, it's not clear that it could survive, certainly if it gets it twice. So is there a problem that he should have said, with or without the law, this is the right thing to do? With or without the law, we should stop hiring white people because racial targets are what matter most. In other words, was the value that he failed to espouse the value of racialism that the board holds? We don't know. Maybe they think the letter was too racist. Maybe they think the letter wasn't racist enough. Maybe they think he should have been wholehearted and been like, guys, we're going to stop hiring white people. I don't care whether there's going to be a fine. I want to do it. We've asked the board to please clarify. I'm putting it in a kind of layman's terms. You can put it in more logical terms. We've said, please tell us what's going on here. In particular, could you answer the following questions? Is it your policy that the moratorium on hiring whites is still there? Is it your policy that you're only going to hire a white candidate at a particular level after you've hired a certain number of non-white candidates in order to get closer to the target? Or is it your policy that you're going to hire on merit, even if this means you go further away from your target? And what policy would you choose if there was no laws about this? So we look forward to a response on that. We've also written a letter to, our lawyers have written a letter to the President Ramaphosa's attorneys this morning. Why? Well, because Dis-Chem is it's really a big mistake to think Dis-Chem is the big problem here. The big problem is the legal framework. Minister Thulas Nxesi, Minister of Employment and Labour, last year promised us more aggressive race law. He said that while introducing the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, that's what's going to give him the power to set the race targets and say, if you don't hit those race targets, we can ramp up fines eventually up to 10% of turnover, which is going to bankrupt just about any business in the country. He has ramped up, or his department has ramped up audits on people's or businesses' submissions on their employment equity. They have already started ramping up fines under the current schema. Okay, we've tracked many steps that Minister Nxesi's department has taken, and it's very clear to us that this is what Saltzman was referring to as the reason that Dis-Chem is doing it. So we've said to Ramaphosa, if you want a concrete example of the inhuman, chilling effect that this thing is having on business, here it is. You think it's the only one? I doubt it. Why? Gross fixed capital formation is roughly a third of what the ANC's National Development Plan wants it to be. That's the rate at which factories are being built and so on. People are not putting in their money there, even though Ramaphosa sent his advertising agents around the world to ask them to do so. And they were much better than Zuma's. Unemployment is up. The economy is flat. Nothing's going the way it's supposed to be going if people were investing money. It looks a lot like a lot of companies are like, we don't want to put our money in here. We don't want to do new hires here. We don't want to grow here. Why? Well, partly because if you don't do it according to the right look, you're going to get screwed over by fines. And I mean, screwing a coffin plank together to another coffin plank and then putting the South African economy in it and burying it in the ground. We don't want that. And we know most South Africans don't want it. Firstly, because 23,000 people signed our petition to the president to veto the Employment Equity Amendment Bill. Secondly, because our polling shows 80% of South Africans, at least in each race group, don't want a Dis-Chem policy. They want a merit policy. We asked in 2020, and 15% of white respondents said, please don't hire white people, only hire black people. And it is less than 20% for all race groups.
Presumably those people are already employed.
Or they're inheriting money, or they're work on radio, like my favorite radio.
Or they're lying to a survey pollster to look good. But anyway.
Exactly. Okay. So, but without taking any more time, we look forward to the president's response. I hope that other businesses will stand up to it and say, look, this is a difficult choice. It's an impossible choice. Hit your quota or cut the business. Really, we should go for merit, and I think there's a dangerous risk here of this story fading into the background, Dis-Chem not answering the questions, not making it clear what their policy is, of people thinking, this is a Dis-Chem issue, not a national issue. We're going to do what we can to avoid that. Our lawyers are going to keep asking for answers, and we at the campaigns team are also going to keep asking for answers until we get them.
And we will put a link to anyone who wants to support our campaign there in the comments section on YouTube below. So if you're listening on audio only, check us out on YouTube. You'll find the link there. Okay. Another thing I just want to very briefly mention before we get into our first proper story of today is what's going on in the UK. We talked about yesterday. We talked about what an absolute mess it was. And after we recorded that episode, there was further messes where the British government, the Conservative Party, had a contentious vote over whether to allow fracking in the country, where some of their own MPs apparently tried to revolt. And the whole thing was a total disaster, which involved shouting and pushing and shoving and nastiness to each other, and more resignations. Apparently, the chief whip had to be talked out of resignation in a 3-hour conversation. Just utterly disastrous. I don't think I've ever seen such a spectacular political implosion in a while. It's
I think you
quite
should boycott the ANC before you say
hey,
that.
not yet. The ANC maybe will one day follow what the Tories are doing now, but we're not there yet. This has been, and if Liz Truss doesn't resign in the next 20 minutes, I will be surprised, because man, what a mess. She apparently also didn't even vote for her own legislation, which supposedly was supposed to be a confidence measure. Which that is, could you mess it up more? And she says she does. So whatever. Anyway, complete disaster. I'm sure we'll be talking about that next week when Liz Truss inevitably goes. Okay, so we've had a long introduction here, but let me get on to our first story here. And this is about Johannesburg. So just a personal anecdote. Of course, I live in Johannesburg. We had load shedding today. Everyone has load shedding. But then the power didn't come back for an hour. Okay, that sometimes happens. Then it came back for about 30 seconds. Then it went off again. And about 15 minutes later, it came back on. It's still on, hopefully, now. But we're getting load shed again, I think, at 4 or 6 or something. Anyway. At the same time, people I know across the city have been without water. On top of load shedding, on top of all these other problems. And the city itself is engaged in a massive battle with Rand Water, where both sides are pointing fingers at each other, Joburg's blaming Rand Water's blaming Joburg for the lack of water supply to to the city. The mayor of Joburg, or the new ANC mayor, has just announced that it is in fact a crisis after initially saying that it wasn't such a big deal. Well, another layer to this is that the former mayor, the DA councillor Mpho Phalatse, has been taking to court her removal from the office of the mayor. She says that it was unlawfully done. So the case was heard in court yesterday. The DA says that there was a programming meeting where the agenda was set up for the council, but that there was no quorum at this meeting because all of the coalition councillors from the DA, Action SA, ACDP, etc., stayed away from this programming meeting, and therefore its decisions were not legal. And these decisions included setting up a motion of no confidence in the mayor. Apparently, the vote of no confidence, the sitting at which it was going to be heard, was called at 6 p.m. on Thursday for the vote to be held at 10 o'clock on Friday the next day. So they say that unless there are extraordinary circumstances, any motion of no confidence requires at least 3 days notice to all councillors before the council sitting. They also claim the speaker, who is the Cope councillor and defector, Colleen Maibe, I think her name is, Colleen Maibe, she apparently is, as the new speaker didn't allow the DA to have a caucus break, they say. They went on to say that, look, it doesn't matter whether we have the votes or not to survive a future vote of no confidence. There's a rule here, which is that you have to follow the procedures of council to correctly remove someone. And we want the record essentially to be set straight and this appointment declared illegal to protect the rule of law. The ANC and the current governing coalition's sort of legal team said that the removal was justified because Mpho Phalatse knew that a motion of no confidence was, quote unquote, cooking around her tenure, regardless of whether it had been officially announced to the programming meeting or not. Their lawyer said, having regard to that original motion is important because it gives credence to the fact that the former Joburg mayor knew something was cooking. Not only did she know something was cooking, she knew the ingredients, but she simply refused to show up when the meal was served. They also further argued that regardless of the legality of the programming meeting or council sitting that was held beforehand, the election of the ANC mayor was democratic and therefore should be ruled valid regardless. At the same time, there were protests outside the court, both by the DA and some of their coalition partners in support of Mpho Phalatse, and some of the ANC and Al Jamaha, who originally brought the motion of no confidence. Apparently, there was a bit of an altercation where Al Jamaha booed Mpho Phalatse so she couldn't be heard to speak and tore up some DA posters. So very nasty, very messy. Gabriel, based off of just maybe what else you've read in my brief little summary here of the legal situation, I mean, what do you make of the two sides' cases from the sounds of it? Do you think this is particularly helpful? What's your take on this whole messy situation?
Yeah, no. So it does seem to me pretty straightforward, although I could be wrong, that Mpho Phalatse is right to say that the vote of no confidence was illegal. I can see why some people might think, okay, hell's teeth, it wasn't properly done, but the outcome was inevitable, so don't fight this. I think that's a terrible mistake. Terrible mistake. I have said this before. I think we discussed this on an episode of Two Crickets in Thorntree. One of the big fears that I have is that the ANC and the EFF are going to continue to find common ground in terms of policies that they implement that damage the country. Talked about the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, the Expropriation Bill, the Land Courts Bill, the new way of interpreting the Prevention Legal Eviction Act. We have gone through various ways in which South Africa's economy is being further undermined by a policy mix. The Bella Bill on education. We've got the world's worst public school system. Instead of making it better, we're looking at further centralizing the education system and freezing out parents from student governing boards. I can go through the health sector, the national health insurance idea of chasing away young doctors and nurses. There really is a lot of bad news happening. And you see it in the economic results. You see it in the unemployment results. Very difficult thing for a lot of people to get their heads around. But, I think Dr. Frans Cronje, former CEO of the IRR, did an exceptional job in all 3 of his books of explaining why material conditions are connected to the ANC's popularity. Why Thabo Mbeki did much better than Nelson Mandela, even though he was less charming, less charismatic, had less struggle credentials, etc., etc. It's because people's lives were getting better. As people's lives get worse, there's less voting for the ANC. Okay, coalition trouble. Are they attractive to other voters? Well, polling shows most ANC voters like the idea of a coalition that'll beat the ANC. So that's my favorite stat. You can go look it up. The ANC is increasingly facing down the same pathway that so many other race nationalist parties have, which is where it can no longer win by giving voters what they want in life, and the temptation will become ever greater to win by stealing elections. So when a vote of no confidence, when an election, when any democratic bestowal of power is not done according to procedure, South Africa's integrity is threatened very directly. I am very eager for this thing to be resolved hastily, because I think as long as the confusion goes on, it is damaging to the trust in our institutions. And it's important that we don't just spread fear and loathing, because we have to have credible elections. We have to have credible procedures for changing power, and we have to have people believing in it. It's not just good to have conspiracy theories floating around. But this thing needs to be addressed very quickly by the courts. And I think the best possible outcome is they say the removal was illegal. Mpalatse becomes mayor again. And then, fine, they go through the procedure one more time and she gets removed. I know it sounds pro forma. I know it sounds technical. But democracy, technicalities are a very important thing. They're like kneecaps.
Exactly. I think that's a really important point when there's periods of enormous friction and stress. Sticking to the principle that the rules is rules is often very important in preventing that friction from turning into fire. I think it's sort of the oil that keeps everything together. So I agree with you completely on that point. I think it's a really important one to make. Sholan, your take on this generally, but also, maybe also the DA is hoping beyond the rule of law argument here, that if they can get back in, maybe they can win over the PA again and crack up the ANC's coalition, so that they can sneak in on the next motion of no confidence. Do you think there's any chance of that?
Sure, Nick. So definitely, up whether the council meeting initially was illegal or whatever the case may be, the court will decide, and I think then we could have a discussion whether or not they're right or wrong. But exactly what you're mentioning right now, Nick. I think that one of the biggest issues is that getting Paul back into the executive mayor seat is not necessarily a silver bullet, because I think that there are still deep underlying issues, like in the coalition. In the multi-party government that was initially there, that still needs to be resolved. The fact that some councillors were allegedly bought out by the ANC, that risk still remains. The Twitter spat between the leading coalition partners, like between the DA and Action SA, that still needs to be resolved. Even if the motion of no confidence is eventually brought in, those are still things that need to be resolved, I think, and that requires way more attention, and it needs to be, because you can't just make this promise to your voters that after this court battle, then we're going to be back in government, just for you to be removed and not be able to govern. That just erodes further trust, as Gabriel was saying, in the processes that's supposed to take place, and in the political parties themselves. So I definitely think that this is really a rather terrible storm, and one of the reasons why I might be happy that I don't reside in Gauteng maybe right now, because I'm with the electricity crisis, the water crisis.
In the Western Cape, you get a different perspective.
Because I mean, all of these multifaceted crises, whether it's electricity, water, basic services that the government should be delivering, and the chaos of politics. I mean, that just makes it an even more difficult situation for the residents who actually, in the end, suffer the most. More than those major politicians whose personalities are hurt because of comments and accusations, as the residents in the end that actually do suffer, Nick.
Yeah, so a few months ago, I abandoned my plans to move to a small town in the Western Cape, at least for the coming 12 months. But this whole mess is really making me wonder whether I made the right choice on that one. Gabriel, any final thoughts on this before we move on?
Yeah, just to reiterate, 2024 is coming up. The ability of parties that are prepared to stand up for constitutional values like property rights, like non-racialism, is going to be a very important test in this country's history. 2024 is likely to be, one of the elections that people are reading about in textbooks for a long time to come. And this is the build-up. This is the stuff that's going to shape how that works out.
Definitely. All right. Kind of related topic, but worth thinking about, I think, at least a little bit briefly, is the EFF's attempts, it seems, behind the scenes to build some sort of, I don't know what to call it, anti-property rights, anti-race relations coalition across the country. And no, I'm not being generous to them here. But anyway, the EFF and IFP have announced that they are going to be holding a long overdue meeting this week to discuss coalitions around the country. So the meeting is going to be attended by Julius Malema and also Nkosi Hlabisa, who is the IFP leader, as well as Floyd Shivambu, to talk about some areas which perhaps the IFP and EFF can cooperate together to form coalitions. And I suspect that Johannesburg is one of the things on their mind here. Any coalition to run Johannesburg will need the IFP. They're also probably thinking about municipalities across KZN. Floyd Shivambu said of this meeting, I think it was yesterday. Today we held a long overdue meeting in Johannesburg. Political parties led by human beings are not mountains and valleys. They meet, so we met. Okay. They're also apparently discussed political developments in both KZN and Gauteng. And this follows after Julius Malema said a little bit earlier this year that if Paul Mashatile was to become leader of the ANC, that Julius will happily take the EFF into coalition with both the ANC and presumably now the IFP to create a new governing coalition. This is despite the fact that last year Malema referred to Paul Mashatile as one of the most dishonest people ever. You must never meet that guy, this is speaking about Mashatile, and think that something will happen. Through his scheming and political maneuvering, he managed to hold the ANC staff members for 4 months. They thought their salary was coming, and then they said it's 4 months. That's Paul for you. He's a schemer. He works like that. So presumably in the new coalition world, the EFF likes the look of a schemer in coalition with them. But anyway, Sholan, what do you make of all this? Do you think the IFP might be tempted to go in with the EFF, or do you think they're going to resist the siren call here?
I do think, Nick, that it would be a mistake for the IFP to go in that direction. I think they are one of the political parties who stand to gain the most, or from, like the voting base of maybe the likes of the ANC, even maybe some out of the EFF, I think. So I think being co-opted is maybe not the best decision for the IFP to make. And just in general, I think with regards to this meeting and the EFF meeting with the ANC previously as well, I think in KZN and in Gauteng, and I mean, I do not even necessarily agree with any of the policies or the ideological positions of these guys. but I think that they are doing something that we should be taking note of, and that is the fact that they are negotiating in a civil manner. The radicals are negotiating a coalition in a civil manner, and not just for right now, while things are chaotic in Johannesburg or in Gauteng, but also for 2024. And I mean, if, for example, what we just discussed, the multi-party government in Johannesburg, for example, took an initiative like this, and when things were getting really shaky for the coalition, they sat all around the table and were actually able to discuss as mature adults and didn't engage in a freaking rap battle on Twitter, to see who has the best one-liners against each other. I feel like we would have been in a much different situation right now, where Mpopa Lachi might have still been the executive mayor in Johannesburg. And I think that this is actually the way coalition government should be negotiated. It should be sat down, everybody around the table, and discussing their strategic interests. I do not necessarily think that the interest that the EFF or even the ANC have is the best for for South Africans or for citizens, but it is most likely their interest, and they understand what is at stake. Come 2024, that everything is possibly up for grabs, and what they are doing is actually acting. The fact that I must say this, for the fact that I'm living in a world where Julius Malema is acting like an adult and not throwing tables around at the negotiation table, should be an indication of how serious coalition governments are going to be for us. And that's why I even think that the others on the center right should be taking note about what these left-leaning individuals are actually doing, and should be doing it in a much better way, because I mean, their ideas are terrible, but the negotiations are clearly taking place. So what would happen if a proper negotiation could take place with proper ideas? I mean, what great things could possibly happen, Nick, for this country? And I definitely think that opposition parties should be taking note of this, for sure.
So I'm not sure if I entirely agree, because I think initially the negotiations between the other opposition parties, the DA and its allies, were quite cordial, and they all signed this document. It was only keeping the thing together after the facts on the ground changed. I wonder, I suspect an ANC-EFF coalition wouldn't sign a document, because a lot of the favors being traded would be, shall we say, off the books. I don't know. Gabriel, what do you make of this?
Yeah, look, I think Sholan makes a good point about civility and about creating the public perception that you are able to act like a grown-up. And I do think that the coalition partners fighting with each other on Twitter has been a big problem. I think that the court case against Michael Beaumont,
really been a big problem,
of chairperson of Action SA, who accused the DA of trying to bribe someone, and the DA is now trying to take him to court to say that's defamation. I think that's an important one to watch. If they can prove that he was acting in a defamatory fashion, maybe it'll teach a lesson. If they can't, I think it's just going to perpetuate this sideshow, which is a distraction from anyone's real best chance at better service delivery and better policies. As for the IFP, here's a curious thing about the IFP. They just got rid of a mayor in Msinga, which is a part of South Africa that I have been connected with since my childhood. It was calculated to have, in a sense, the lowest GDP per capita, the lowest calorie intake per capita in apartheid South Africa, by the Alcox, Neil and Krina, who were respectively agronomical experts and a journalist back in the day. I visited their homesteads after Neil died in rural Msinga. And I've written a bit about it for the Daily Friend. Anyway, it's a fascinating part of the world. It remains one of the poorest. I don't know, the last public holiday I was there, there was a competition between the cops buying booze in Tugela Ferry on the public holiday. By the way, during lockdown, when booze was illegal to sell or buy,
the rules don't apply in Msinga.
The competition was between the cops and the goat herds and the donkey herders, and there was they were all crowding around the same. You couldn't get past. There was a traffic jam of goats and police buying alcohol. Anyway, it's an amazing part of the world, and the IFP has just gotten rid of its mayor there after he was released on bail, emanating from a firearm charge, as well as 2 councillors. So it's Mleteni Ndlovu, Tokozani Sokela, and Mwaukeleni Sokela, are all directed to take a leave of absence and are on suspension from all party activities. So IFP acting way quicker than old ANC in terms of step aside and whatnot. It's a party I've got a lot of historical sympathy for. I think they've done some good things. Just recently, I was chatting with our IFP MPs about opposing the expropriation bill. It's a very important party that ought to be putting its shoulder to the wheel in terms of defending property rights, defending non-racialism, giving ordinary South Africans the best chance of making their lives a bit better. So I think the EFF is really deeply married to the opposite of that. Speaking to them in theory does no harm, but I think getting into a coalition with them would betray IFP voters. And I think Sholan's most important point is that the IFP stands so much to gain by not doing that.
100%.
That I think it's in their best interest to be smart.
No, I definitely agree with that. IFP resist that siren call because it's like the sirens of Greek myth. If you swim to the island where you hear the beautiful songs coming from, you're liable to be eaten. And I think the EFF are going to very much act in the same way. We're out of time, unfortunately, so we don't have time to cover our third story, but we hope that you found the show interesting. We will, of course, be back next week. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful electricity and water-filled weekend. And we'll see you next week. Cheers, everyone.